About this, what about the dangers of concussions, like getting hit really hard in the head? Can you recover from that?
Yeah, CTE is really big right now. It's a huge conversation.
I think a lot of kids that are getting into MMA right now do not understand the dangers of it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with MMA. I just think that we should all understand what's really going on.
Not even just
there,
MMA, but like football or all kind of contact sports.
Yeah, so this is all these subjects have a lot of medical background to them, and I'm going to try to distill it down a lot. So what I will say is this: there's a bunch of different grading systems that are used to classify concussions, and a concussion is an alteration of consciousness. It's actually a clinical diagnosis. So if you say I got hit in the head, and I blacked out, that's a concussion. Okay. There's no CT evidence. There's no scan that you can do that actually makes the diagnosis. So it's largely clinical. So he got hit. I saw him act a little bit woozy. That's a concussion. And then the grading systems grade them mild, moderate, severe based upon a number of different factors. So let's take the worst case scenario, and then we'll work our way back. Since it's a clinical thing, if you felt you were blacked out or you felt you were woozy, by definition, you have a concussion, and then we can grade it from mild upwards. So let's take brain injury. If I hit you in the head with an object and break the skull and injure the brain and cause bleeding in the brain, that's the worst type of injury that can happen to you. Okay.
Holy shit! Yeah,
that's the worst type of injury. So
bad.
This is car accidents, hitting an airbag, hitting the windshield, being ejected from the car, hitting it on the ground, a baseball bat to the head, bottle to the head, falling down, hitting your head on the stairs. All the types of things that happen in life. That's severe brain injury usually occurs, and it takes a couple of different types. One, penetrating injury. Something's broken and goes into the brain. You have to go in there, fish it out, clean it up, repair it, right? And then they deal with the underlying brain injury related to that, because when you repair this stuff, you repair the skull, you repair the scalp, you can take problem things out, but you can't repair the brain directly, so you take the pressure off, right? So that's open injury, penetrating injury. Then there's a subset of injuries called closed head injuries. This is where somebody hits you, let's say open palm to the head, or something where you fall down, no obvious injury on the outside part of the skull or in the scalp, but you hear people go home, they felt fine, they went home, they went to sleep, never woke up again. So there's a subset of blood clots that can occur underneath the skull because of the brain shifting very rapidly due to force. And so there are three basic types of blood clots. Two that occur on the outside of the brain, inside the skull, but outside the brain because there's a space in there. One's called an epidural hematoma, epi outside of the brain. One's called a subdural hematoma. It's underneath the covering of the brain. So one's above the covering of the brain, one's below the covering of the brain, but both of them are outside of the brain. In other words, inside the skull, but then there's a brain. And then there's blood clots into the brain. Think of this like a bruise. If you get hit and you see a black and blue, the black and blue is actually in the substance of the skin. You can have a bruise like that that's in the substance of the brain. So these all come under the class of closed head injury. So the first one I talked about is penetrating. Something went into the brain and the skull and what have you. Closed head injury is typically what you're talking about in your projectile sports. Things are thrown. Baseball to the head, football to the head, soccer, heading a soccer ball, getting hit. So this is the football, boxing, those types of things. So in those types of disciplines, getting hit in such a way that it causes a rotational movement on the brain is what causes this bleeding on the outside or inside the brain. Now that's blood clots and where they can occur, and then there's another type of injury that we should talk about, which is what's called a diffuse axonal shear injury. It means bruising, like small bruising within the brain, and it happens when the brain is turned very rapidly. So think about a hook punch to the chin. Think about something like that where the brain is not concussed, in such a way that the side of the head or anything is struck and the brain is not jiggling against the inside of the skull. It's rotating. And because the brain, well, the brain has two different types of matter, gray matter and white matter. The white matter is very firm. The gray matter is a little bit softer. And where those two things can shear against each other, you can get these bleeding things in there. These can be seen on imaging studies, on MRI and CT scan, and so that constitutes a difference. Can you have a shear injury with no blood clot? Yes. Can you have blood clots with no shear injury? Yes. Can you have a penetrating injury to the head with none of the others? Unlikely, because usually the force is so great that you have all three of them. So you can have those penetrating, closed head that's blood clot related, whether it's outside or inside the brain, then you can have shear injuries. And if you don't have any of those, you can still have a concussion. So getting hit in
the head is a bad idea. Is that what we're saying?
So the things that happen in MMA and in fighting are going to be the concussion. I got hit. I don't know what happened. I blacked out and I feel woozy. Concussion by definition. I can scan your brain. I don't see the shear injury. I don't see the blood clots. I don't see anything penetrating, but you had brain injury clinically. And can you also be struck significantly in the side of the head and cause a blood clot? Sure. Can you be hit, uppercut and cross and then end up with a shear injury, a vertebral artery injury, and some of the other things we mentioned relative to the neck? Yes, because all of those are possible in striking sports. So when we're talking about the consequences of getting struck, you realize in my mind, I'm trying to exclude all those different mechanisms, and your question is specifically this, but it's rarely ever just that. In other words, if I twist your head really rapidly and don't cause you to hurt, you can still feel a little bit woozy just because your head spun. And you might say that's in the brain because of a concussion. It's not. It's a middle ear problem. Okay? So there's a lot of different mechanisms that are going on in a fight situation to try to strip out just the brain injury part. But having said that, to get struck in the head, the thing that causes the problem with brain injury is what's called acceleration deceleration. To have your brain going from stationary to instantaneously being accelerated by striking it is what causes the bruising. And if you bruise anything repetitively over time,
it's going to cause problems.
It's going to cause problems primarily because the brain is electrical jello. I mean, that's one way to think about it, right? It's a mass of jelly cells that are conducting information, and it conducts it. Nothing's moving in there. Really, it's just the sensitivity of one cell electrically to the sensitivity of another cell's electrically, and they relate to each other and they share electrical signal. All you have to do is jolt it for it to change. So if you bruise the brain, you cut off certain pathways of conduction, you make things that conducted at a certain speed conduct slower, you make things that used to conduct in a certain direction not go in that direction, and it can cause a lot of havoc, obviously.